second quarter, the end of the first half of the year, and oil prices are trading this morning in Asia robustly $116 and change. They've come off a little bit in this morning's trade, but nothing really dramatic. We've seen a consistent recovery this week, as it would appear supply concerns are trumping demand, recession concerns, at least this week. Last week, it was a little bit different. Let's kick off immediately in China with Albert Stromquist, principal at Landstrom Advisors. Good morning, Albert. Is China going to emerge out of its COVID lockdown, economic sort of slow heartbeat in the second half of the year, and be a raging demand in oil?
Good morning, Sean. Fair question. I think the short answer is no, because it's a very important political year in China this year, and every step that China is currently taking is very carefully measured. Now, today they announced a slight rollback in regulations on foreign visitors arriving in China. In terms of quarantine, from 4 weeks to 2 weeks to 1 week. So that is it's a step in the right direction, possibly a first green shoot of a reopening of China's borders. But no one here expects a wholesale reopening to pre-COVID travel levels until after the 2022 political year is complete, and the party has met in October and processed the approval of the president's third term.
Given that just a quick follow-up on that, obviously there's a lot of coverage or reporting in the last few months through the second quarter of the harshness of the lockdown and the general displeasure of the public towards it. Is there any hangover from that?
Yeah, there is. Well, the public is very displeased, but the public has no power to actually affect any level of influence on the role of the government. So the government's taking steps now to reinvigorate the economy, to restart industry. But the public has been stunned by the events of the last 3 months, and are kind of looking for answers, have more questions than answers at this time.
Let's go to London with Kate Durian, Mies contributing editor and non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Kate, OPEC meet tomorrow, the last day of June, the last day of the half year. Is this a complicated meeting for them?
I don't think so. I think they're just going to, they've agreed that they will release the last of the barrels that they withdrew in 2020 by the end of August. So I think what they will do is, the agreement itself, the so-called Declaration of Cooperation, still stands until the end of the year. So they have those 3 months to tweak supply if they need to. And if you look at sort of demand forecasts, which may yet be revised, they're going to over 101 million barrels a day, according to the IEA. So I think it's, this supply tightness seems to be with us for a while. You've got so many outages. And if that partial embargo by the EU and this price cap they're talking about comes into effect, then we're going to see a lot more tightness in 2023.
And in that, just a quick follow-up, do you think there's any intersection point between the OPEC meeting tomorrow and the upcoming Joe Biden visit to the region? Is there a nexus in which those two cross into a conversation?
I don't think so. This OPEC and OPEC Plus, and particularly the fact that it's still being co-managed by Russia and Saudi Arabia, there's no sign that they're going to drop this alliance. They don't want to be seen to be dictated to by the United States, by the EU, by the UK. You may find some, wording in a joint statement that will give something, to Biden. But I don't think it's going to mean they're going to open the taps, voluntarily and unilaterally, even though Saudi Arabia has done in the past, when they needed to cut supply in 2020, it voluntarily reduced its own supply by 1 million barrels when it was needed. So there is precedent, but I don't think at this point they see the need to do anything until they can see just how much. And also, the agreement ends in a month or two. So I don't think it's actually going to make any difference. Come September, they could just say, okay, no quotas, anybody who can produce should produce. But we're hitting close to capacity. And if you look at spare production capacity, it's pretty tight already. With Saudi
Which begs
Arabia.
the question, what would you agree a new agreement on? Let's maybe come back to that point a little bit later and bring in Rustin Edwards, head of fuel oil procurement at Euronav. Rustin, you've been one of our loudest voices on the demand destruction side of the narrative, the concern of the market through Q2. How do you see that playing out? It seems that demand is quite robust. I mean, it's resilient to these high prices so far.
Well, I would pull back on being quite robust. If you look at the latest API data in the United States, you had builds in gasoline and distillates. We haven't seen EI data for 2 weeks now because of their computer issues around voltage. Most likely they got hacked somehow and they just couldn't get the data out of their systems. But anytime you see a crude oil draw of 3 million barrels and almost 5.5 million barrel build in products, that doesn't show you that demand is too robust in the United States. I mean, you do see the drop off in sales on credit card data. I think Bloomberg had a report on that the retail sales from gasoline were dropping, as well as other service related activities such as restaurants and travel. So you are seeing that consumer pullback as the inflationary pressure bites across the world. I mean, I would not be surprised to see builds in products and draws and cruise from the EIA data. We are going into the July 4th weekend in the United States, which should be a big demand pull. But I think the data out of Memorial Day was lackluster. It was not as strong as everybody thought it was going to be coming out of the US. So the big product draws did not happen. And I think consumers are going to be a lot more careful in how they look at their budgets going forward, especially when you've got companies now talking about layoffs. You have Wall Street talking about layoffs. So there's a lot of employment pressure that's starting to rear its ugly head. Novartis cutting 8,000 jobs worldwide. It's coming.
And just to follow up on that, are we seeing that trickle through to container rates, freight rate?
Well, it's sort of container markets are a completely different world when it comes to demand because their log jams are happening in the ports. You've got more boxes trying to get out that are empty, getting back to the supply point than the shipping ports can handle. Rotterdam's had a big upswing in capacity utilization of the port facilities as empty boxes are crowding out the new boxes coming in. So it still creates these supply chain issues that are just going to be prevalent until supply chains even out. The way you get supply chains to even out is you get more demand destruction on consumer goods, which again, looks like that's happening when you look at the data coming out of the United States and coming here in Europe. Consumer confidence is dropping, consumer consumption is dropping.
Albert, looking at the demand issues in Asia, the outlook for obviously the story that Rustin just articulated in terms of the U.S. outlook. China at this point in around the first half of the year, they had targeted a GDP growth for the year of 5.5%. I'm just wondering from your perspective, what would be, are we going to be half of that? I mean, last week we had President Xi make a speech that indicated that they were still going to try and reach that.
That's a funny question. In fact, his speech suggested that if they didn't reach that, they would reach that by fiat, right? It would be a given that their GDP growth was 5.5%. Fitch a few days ago downgraded their forecast to 4.3%. And there are another range of economists that are taking even a more pessimistic view, saying, look, China may be lucky to squeeze out a 2% growth this year. and may even face recession. That would not bode well for the discussions that will take place in Beijing in October. Therefore, it's almost foregone that the narrative will be a strong 5.5% GDP growth.
And from the point of view of growth equal, obviously energy consumption it would be in decline, but energy imports, oil imports might stay elevated or given the availability of cheap discounted Russian oil. What's your outlook for that purchasing to continue or grow?
Well, it's been relatively flat the past few months. Like I think the most recent number is about 10.5 million imports. There's a bit of a disconnect in the information I've seen. I was kind of guided by a view that Russian oil imports were accounting for about 400,000 barrels per day. Yet there was a number that came out yesterday that said they've just last month imported 2 million barrels from Russia. The stress point has been the divergent objectives of the state oil refiners versus the private refiners. The state oil refiners are giving a wide berth to Russian oil because they have more international exposure and don't want to be seen to be accommodating Russian attempts to place more oil into their market. The private refiners are quietly taking that Russian oil, but the private refiners have limited capacity themselves. So the information is in many ways conflicting as to the true situation, which leaves the door open to all sorts of conspiracy theories, I suppose, on what's actually happening in the refining sector. But for the market, the demand remains soft for both motor fuels, for transportation fuels, and jet aviation fuels. The market is still essentially a domestic market for aviation. So until that begins to pick up, the fuel demand will remain soft.
Kate, I just wanted to pick up on that question. We talked a little earlier about the nexus between these variety of geopolitical issues. We had a question on our polling yesterday asking whether our audience thought that the OPEC Plus would renew its agreement. And by an overwhelming majority, 75% said yes, 25% said no. I was one of the no's because I struggled to see what they would agree on. What would be an agreement say? What would the words on the page actually, what would they write down? What would the quotas be? I see it very difficult to see what that would look like. What are your thoughts on what that could literally look like?
Well, as I said, the Declaration of Cooperation doesn't actually expire in September. It goes on to the end of the year, so they have time to sort of think about it. But I think the easiest thing, I suppose, would be to drop the quotas altogether, which they've done in the past, and just say, okay, the production cut agreement, the supply management agreement is over, but the coordination isn't, so that it still stands until the end of the year. So if there's any need to take action, they will. But if the market looks tight, after August, then I suppose they can do something about it. But I think they would, there won't be a written agreement. It's just that the agreement stands. This cooperation, they don't want to drop Russia because they don't know when this war is going to end, when they're going to need Russia again. And if you look at OPEC, their market share is their share of the market is going to fall because, all these producers who can't produce beyond current levels. You've got Angola, Nigeria, Algeria is pushing close to capacity. These reports that the UAE is, which I don't believe, it's not pushing close to capacity, but I think the numbers that are declared, like even by Saudi Arabia, are a bit higher than their actual total maximum sustainable capacity. So I think there's a lot of questions as to how much Saudi Arabia can actually produce. You've got the US, which isn't growing as fast as people thought they would. You've got the geopolitical tensions. You've got Libya out. You've got the only positive might be if the Iran nuclear talks, which began in Doha yesterday, actually succeed in bringing Iran back. But already we're seeing a sort of loosening of not the sanctions themselves, but the monitoring of sanctions. Iranian oil is still finding its way to market. You've got maybe another 1.5 million, plus all the storage they have, 60 million plus barrels that can
So
be.
I suppose I struggle to see then, what does Joe Biden get for going to Riyadh and with his tail between his legs? If he doesn't get a divorce in OPEC Plus, he's not getting any more oil. The president of the United States conceding a major geopolitical posture and gets nothing? That seems odd.
Well, as I said, the wording, you just have to look at the wording of whatever they come up with after his visit. There'll be lots of platitudes and talk of future cooperation and pledges of, ensuring that the market is balanced. You've been there before, you've seen it. It doesn't necessarily mean that there will be more oil on the market. I think, there will be a gesture, obviously, because, these things will have be negotiated beforehand, but to see a sort of flood of Saudi oil hit the market, I don't think so. But that's.
No. It seems there's a lot of shuttle diplomacy going on at the moment. MBS went to Egypt, went to Turkey. This activity in Doha this week, and so forth. Is it adding up to anything other than the normal platitudes? We'll see. Let's go, Rustin. All things Europe, all things supply concerns out of Russia, still flowing, still looking quite solid. Your outlook for that moving forward, Russian oil and products beating the market, reaching the market?
Well, they have found the homes for their oil, for both their products and their crude oil. So, Russia's actually increasing their exports, not decreasing. So all the talk of Russia oil vanishing from the market is all for naught, in my opinion. We've seen more crude being exported out. They're finding homes to put the crude oil. They're finding homes for the products. They've actually returned some refinery capacity back to operation, which, one of the refineries was hit by a drone by potentially Ukraine, but still, nevertheless, they brought refining capacity back online because they have found places to push the product. You've got utility demand in the Middle East, which they're more than happy to buy cheap Russian fuel oil to help fuel their desalination and power needs as we go into the summer. You've got gas oil from Russia heading into Africa, which the African nations are happy to receive cheap discounted gas oil versus European produced material. So voila, there is a solution to every problem.
And the outlook has been that this sort of shipping insurance and the sanctions, a la EU and so forth, and what they were discussing at the G7 meeting could come into play in the second half of the year and be much more disruptive. Your thoughts on that?
Again, the insurance that they're talking about only apply to people who are applying the sanctions. So if you're playing the sanctions game, then yes, you've already capped the insurance, so that's already happened. And so, yeah, if you're a EU or UK insurance provider, you're not going to be able to ship Russian products. However, there are workarounds, and those solutions have already been employed. That's why cargoes are moving. That's why all the exports have not dropped off. There are people willing to push their ships into what we like to call the dark fleet, where they pull themselves out of an EU regulatory mindset. They reflag the ship in a country that is friendly to Russia, and solutions found. And those solutions have been done. So there should be very little drop off in Russian supply to market. I think what the EU and what the G7 is trying to accomplish is really just more of a political statement than anything else. I don't think it's going to have any real teeth.
Well, what does have teeth, of course, today is the pathway for Sweden and Finland to join NATO, with Turkey abandoning its objection. The news this week of
that kind of goes into the face of what Putin's fear was with Ukraine becoming part of NATO. Okay, now he's surrounded by NATO. Congratulations.
There's NATO weapons coming obviously significantly into that fight without it being NATO soldiers. I wonder if that escalates in the second half. Let's go to the survey question this morning, sort of tackling this subject of supply tightness concerns versus demand destruction. So through Q2, oil markets have been caught in an arm wrestle of concern between supply tightness and demand destruction. it looks like supply tightness won out in Q2 to me, given the price of oil. But which will win out in Q3? Will demand destruction finally come up on the inside lane and the back straight and surpass the concerns of supply disruption? What are your thoughts in Q3 as we sort of take a temperature in looking ahead as we do? Albert, looking across Asia, where there is a kind of a building post-COVID pent-up demand appetite like we've seen in the West, flights are full. Somebody was telling me yesterday that to get tickets for Wimbledon, they're 3 times the price they were in 2019, the last time Wimbledon happened. Not a 5% inflation, not a 10% inflation, but a 300% inflation for Wimbledon tickets. What does the pent-up demand in Asia look like, Albert? And how much of a headwind is a strong dollar and high energy prices against that sort of post-COVID pent-up demand that we saw elsewhere in the world?
I don't think the demand for foreign products has abated at all. They may be certainly the supply chain delays in getting foreign products into China, and with the improvement of the dollar index, I mean those are the retail prices will certainly rise here on foreign goods in China. I think an interesting proxy for pent-up demand is air tickets. Given the limited number of seats available outbound from China, the scalpers have really kind of cornered the market on air tickets, with published prices trading at sometimes a factor of 20 times published price. So it's enormously expensive for anyone wishing to fly out of China to any destination. It's not like Singapore would be cheap and Europe would be high. Just the ticket on the flight out of China is very high. So there is huge demand here among the population for travel. I mean, they're accustomed to it, the Chinese people, to traveling the world. They really want to get back out in the world again. And there's plenty of people here who are, have been stuck during COVID who are trying to get out. So it's kind of a serious situation.
And Albert, just looking on the other story, I wanted to get your views on LNG gas demand ahead of next winter. We've seen in the move in recent weeks with Russia cutting or reducing its supply to Germany in particular, and the scramble for gas for ahead of next winter, and how that puts then Europe in competition with Asia for limited. I wonder, how do you see that playing out, and who are the winners and the losers there?
Well, I certainly see Asia and China in particular taking advantage of available spot cargoes and buying when the price is right to improve their storage, and coming into the later into the winter months. I expect that to continue. Beyond that, I really don't have
well, I mean, from the point of view of obviously that competition point driving prices even higher, perhaps, as we move forward. Kate, just wanted to get your thoughts. I can't but be sort of absorbed a little bit by political leadership in Europe, and particularly Boris Johnson under great duress at home, it would appear. And Macron lost the parliament in France, and so forth. So this sort of political weakness. Who will Boris fall? What is the outlook for political weakness in leadership in Europe?
Well, I mean, in the case of the UK, we're seeing a lot of we're seeing rail strikes. You can't even get out if you want to fly out. I mean, the airports are a disaster, they're chaotic. Boris survived a no confidence vote. So, he wasn't ousted. He's sort of safe for a year, but there's still rumblings within the party because, they've lost 2 more seats. But, he's a Houdini. He manages to survive somehow. But I don't think, having lost Angela Merkel, whose legacy now is looking not as rosy as it was when she was in power, I think it's a bit, leadership in Europe is a bit, has been weakened. Macron, as you said, has lost a majority in parliament. You've got Boris Johnson, who's facing challenges right, left, and centre. You've got Scotland, announcing a referendum. So, the whole Brexit deal, the border with Ireland. I mean, there's just so many issues. But I think, what's really, I think, scary is that as this war drags on, it stops being in the headlines. And you sort of have this sort of, you know what it's like. After a while, people just get tired of listening, except when there's a major attack, like, the horrible attack on the shopping mall the other day in central Ukraine. And then you sort of start focusing on these internal issues that are really building, there's a lot of pressure over inflation, rail strikes, jobs, the NHS, even judges, you're seeing. So there's a lot of.
And there's a lot of that austerity still to come in the second half of the year, the vis-a-vis with higher interest rates, as well as cutbacks and rationing of gas and such things. I mean, the second half of the year does look like it could be quite precarious. Let's get the survey result to give Rustin the last word this morning. Supply concern through Q2, oil markets have been caught, and supply concern will win out in Q3 a little bit more. Rustin, the story also obviously of Q2 has been not less really about crude oil, of course, has been elevated, but the real elevation, Rustin, has been in the area of products and refinery capacity shortage. What's your outlook for that easing, or that being able to facilitate more demand in the third quarter?
Well, it is a case that certain products are sky high prices. Gas oil is very high because the price of hydrotreating, which is highly linked to the price of natural gas in Europe, keeps up. As long as natural gas is high, the cost of desulfurization is high. So a lot of your lower sulfur products become very expensive. One of the interesting things when you're looking at product cracks, however, is you have a very large disconnect of naphtha, which is your base stock for making gasoline, to the rest of the oil complex, which is an indicative sign of lack of industrial demand for those products. Naphtha cracks are at minus $30 a barrel right now in Europe, which the last time we had a disconnect of naphtha cracks from crude and from the other products was every time in a recession. So you always have they're kind of a leading indicator of what is due to happen. And this is the biggest disconnect I have seen in naphtha in a long time. High sulfur fuel as well in itself, another baseline product, is kind of molding along. But when you look at the diesel and the VLSFO markets, which are lower sulfur in nature, they're very expensive because it's all tied back to the price of natural gas. So you do have this massive disconnect of how the products are performing in the marketplace. I think that the lack of refining capacity is starting to come back into more balanced refining capacity as you have the new Kuwait refinery coming online, you have Jizan coming online, you have the Malaysian refining complex, Johor, that caught fire last year, is now coming fully back online. So you can start seeing this balance of how much crude people are exporting versus products people are exporting. So we could see less exports of OPEC crude because they have larger refineries that have come online and they're going to start producing more products to the marketplace. And everybody seems to want to discount or ignore the Dangote refinery in Nigeria, which is a 600,000 barrel per day plant, which is scheduled to come online here in Q3. So Nigerian exports are going to drop, but their product availability to the market is going to be bigger than there was before. They're going to become more self-reliant once the refinery becomes fully online. And that's going to push products back into Europe and back to the United States, where the current West African flow comes from. So I think in Q3, we are going to start seeing some shifting of crude demand or crude supply to market versus product supply to market as these refineries come online.
Well, that's quite interesting. We'll have to wrap it up there. Brent crude oil trading in Asia at 117.28, heading back towards that place of 120 where it was a week or so ago, or where a week, 10 days ago, before it collapsed last week. Now it's back up again. So it looks, as the result of the survey said, supply concerns are still trumping demand destruction. We had a good interview this week with Joe McMonigal of the IEF. who is calling very real outlook for 100, still reach 150 in the second half of the year for all the different reasons we've been talking about. But his big one is the lack of capital investment in a new supply, new production, and with inflated interest rates, this is going to make it even more difficult for money to flow into the ground for new capacity. So that's his view. Thank you, Rustin. Thank you, Albert. Thank you, Kate. Have a great rest of the week. We'll catch up at 10:30 every morning for the Daily Energy Markets podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.